2 hours ago, the war entered its most dangerous phase yet. Not because of a missile strike or a ship sinking, because of 19 words posted on Truth Social at 7:44 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. If Iran doesn't fully open, without threat, the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. The deadline expires at 7:44 p.m. Eastern on Monday, 3:14 a.m. Tuesday in Tehran. Iran's response arrived within hours. The Iranian army issued a statement that all U.S. energy infrastructure in the region would become legitimate targets if Iranian power plants were struck. Iran's Parliament Speaker Qalibaf posted a map of Gulf power plants on social media with a single warning: say goodbye to electricity. That exchange, a presidential ultimatum and a counter-threat of regional infrastructure destruction, represents the first time in 24 days of war that both sides have publicly set a specific deadline for escalation into a category of targets that neither has struck yet. Power plants, electrical grids, the infrastructure that keeps tens of millions of people across the Middle East alive. This is not a rhetorical escalation. It is a structural one. And it arrived less than 24 hours after Trump said the U.S. was considering winding down its military efforts. What striking power plants actually means, and why neither side has done it yet. To understand why the power plant ultimatum represents a qualitative shift in the conflict, you have to understand what striking civilian electrical infrastructure means under both military doctrine and international humanitarian law, and why neither side has done it yet, despite 24 days of intensive strikes. Power plants are not simply military targets. In a modern society, electricity is the substrate on which everything else depends. Hospitals run on it. Water treatment plants run on it. Dialysis machines, incubators, ventilators, all run on it. Striking power generation facilities is explicitly restricted under Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, and which prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population when the purpose is to deny them to civilians. The U.S. military has operated under rules of engagement in this conflict that have, to this point, deliberately avoided civilian electrical infrastructure. That is why, after 7,800 strikes over 24 days, Iran's power grid is functioning. It is also why the European Council issued an urgent call this week for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities, anticipating that both sides were approaching this threshold. Trump's ultimatum crossed that threshold rhetorically on Saturday night. The question now is whether it crosses it operationally by Monday evening, and the military, legal, and humanitarian consequences of that crossing are categorically different from anything that has happened in this war so far. Iran's counter-threat was equally unambiguous. If its power infrastructure is struck, all U.S. and Israeli energy infrastructure in the region becomes a legitimate target. That formulation covers oil processing facilities in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, LNG terminals in Qatar, pipelines and refineries across the Gulf, the entire physical architecture that keeps the global energy system functioning. The Ras Laffan strike last week, which cut 17% of Qatar's LNG output for potentially 5 years, was a preview. Iran is describing something larger. The gap that a 48-hour deadline cannot close. The 48-hour timeline collides with a set of military realities that make the ultimatum's logic difficult to follow. On Saturday, hours before Trump issued the threat. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper announced that U.S. forces had dropped 5,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on underground Iranian coastal facilities, storing anti-ship cruise missiles and mobile launchers near the Strait of Hormuz. Cooper said Iran's ability to attack vessels in the strait had been degraded. He described the strike as targeting intelligence support sites and missile radar relays used to monitor ship movement. Al Jazeera's correspondents in Washington noted the contradiction immediately. The U.S. military was publicly claiming it had already significantly degraded Iran's ability to threaten the strait, and within hours, Trump was threatening to obliterate power plants unless the strait opened. If the degradation claim is accurate, the ultimatum is unnecessary. If the ultimatum is necessary, the degradation claim is overstated. The strait itself has been closed since March 2nd. Iran's position, stated Sunday by its IMO representative Ali Mousavi, is that the waterway is open to everyone except Iran's enemies, meaning the US and its allies. Iran has indicated willingness to coordinate with the IMO and neutral countries on maritime safety. Foreign Minister Araghchi said this week that Iran had already allowed ships from different countries to pass, and that it was in discussions with Japan about facilitating passage for Japanese vessels. What Iran is offering is not an open strait in the conventional sense. It is a managed strait, one where passage is conditional on diplomatic recognition of Tehran's position, or at minimum, on a distinction between neutral and hostile parties. That offer is politically unacceptable to Washington, but it is strategically coherent from Tehran's perspective. The strait is their primary remaining leverage. They are not going to simply give it up in response to a Truth Social post. The gap between what Trump is demanding, full opening without threat within 48 hours, and what Iran is willing to offer is not a 48-hour gap. It is a structural gap that cannot be closed by a deadline. What happens to energy markets if the deadline is enforced? The energy consequences of power plant strikes on either side would accelerate a crisis that is already at historic levels. Retail gas prices in the United States have risen 93 cents per gallon since the war began. U.S. crude oil is up more than 70% since the start of the year. Brent crude settled at $112 a barrel on Friday. But Goldman Sachs has warned prices could remain above $100 through 2027. The Trump administration was so desperate to contain prices this week that it temporarily lifted sanctions on 140 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting on tankers, an extraordinary move that amounted to buying oil from the country it is simultaneously bombing. Striking Iranian power plants would not lower those prices. It would send them to levels not modeled in any peacetime economic scenario. And Iran without electricity cannot pump, process, or load oil for export, even if it wanted to. A Gulf energy sector that becomes legitimate target for Iranian retaliation, as Iran explicitly threatened Sunday, would see the same facilities that have kept global supply partially intact become active battlefields. The European Council's emergency call for a moratorium on energy and water facility strikes was not humanitarian sentiment. It was economic self-preservation. European gas futures have risen sharply since the war began. The UK and Germany are already managing winter energy reserves that were not designed to absorb a months-long Gulf closure. A power plant exchange between the US and Iran would remove whatever fragile supply stability remains. Pope Leo XIV called the war a scandal to the whole human family at his Sunday Angelus prayer, appealing for an immediate ceasefire. He was speaking from the Vatican as Iranian missiles were still landing in southern Israel, and where the cities of Arad and Dimona had been struck overnight, the first time in 24 days that Iranian projectiles had hit communities near Israel's Negev nuclear research center, with Israeli air defenses failing to intercept the incoming ballistic missiles. The 48-hour clock is running. Iran has said it will not fully open the strait without a cessation of hostilities. Trump has said he will not make a deal. The deadline expires Monday evening, and behind the deadline is a category of escalation that everyone involved, military planners, energy analysts, international lawyers, and the millions of people living near power infrastructure across the Middle East, understands would make everything that has happened in the past 24 days look like a preliminary.